Hello, listeners. Welcome back to Politics Plus Media 101. We are back here with myself, John Gunnison, and with Justin Higgins, our co-host, to talk about some of the action in the U.S. presidential primaries that have been occurring in the last couple of weeks. In particular, today we're going to be talking about the campaign launch of the supposed rival to take down Donald Trump, the Republican Party primary, who is Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. Ron DeSantis announced his much anticipated presidential campaign quite recently, and he did so in an unusual way. He did it not in the traditional rally environment, surrounded by live supporters cheering his name, with his family getting their photo taken, and some patriotic music playing on the speakers. Instead, he announced it on Twitter Spaces. So this is something that we are basically obligated to discuss on this program because, as many of our listeners know, this program actually got its inception on social audio, on the Clubhouse app. Back during the pandemic, when Clubhouse was the hot new thing, we were all enjoying using it so much, and we had a knack for bringing on guests from the world of politics and media. We had lots of great conversations with a live audience in that space, and we have become sort of knowledgeable people about how that world works. So I think that it's only appropriate that we give some analysis on how this whole thing went down.
John, I don't want to use too much hyperbole, but you could say that in the political sphere, we are the leading experts on how social audio works. Would that be going over the line?
Well, I mean, Clubhouse was the big social audio app. It was the one that gave birth to the whole concept. And we had the top political program on that app. And we had a sponsorship with the creators of that app. We were sort of the masters of politics in social audio. So I do not think that is exaggerating to say that we're among, if not the leading experts on this topic.
Yeah, so I think that the main takeaway here from Ron DeSantis' Twitter Spaces launch, is I would go out to venture and say it was the worst political presidential campaign launch in modern history. And I think that you and I kind of knew it was going to end up this way. So before we dig into social audio, before we dig into the launch itself, which we discussed the CNN town hall with Donald Trump, and although it wasn't his launch, it kind of was his launch to the general public. What is a presidential launch? Why does it matter? Does it matter? So I think starting there, a presidential launch can be a good thing for you and can be impactful if you win. And looking back at it, we can say, oh, what a great presidential launch. It kicked off the tour, started momentum. The other way that a presidential launch can matter is if you fall on your face like Ron DeSantis did. For the vast majority of them, we really don't remember. But essentially, the presidential launch is a way for you to get your name out, usually to a wider audience. It's a way to usually set a tone that you are presidential because you have big crowds coming, you're giving a speech, everybody's going nuts, the main points of your speech. And then lastly, for the vast majority of candidates, they all accomplish this and we forget about them. I would argue, for example, one of the better presidential launches we've seen was Kamala Harris. She launched outside, I want to say San Francisco or Oakland, actually, right outside one of the town halls. And all you saw was thousands of people. She gave this big, beautiful, booming speech. Everybody's going nuts. The energy was palpable, and it was a great kickoff to the campaign. So that being said, John, I want to get your take. How much weight should we put into a presidential launch? How should we view this?
So, Justin, when you say that this was the worst presidential campaign launch in recent memory, whenever I hear a claim that is that superlative, my immediate instinct is to try to poke a hole in it and come up with another example that disproves the claim that you've made. So immediately I'm racking my brain trying to think of some campaign launches that have been worse. And I realized that not only can I not really think of examples of campaign launches that were worse, I can hardly think of any actual examples of campaign launches at all. Even of people that won, I have almost no memory of, if I have any memory of their campaign launch. I have no memory of President Obama's presidential campaign launch. None. I have no memory of Mitt Romney's presidential campaign launch. I don't remember where it was, what it looks like, anything about it. I have no memory of President Biden's campaign launch. the person who was the most recently elected president, ran for president just a couple years ago. I have no memory of what that campaign launch was. So I think that it really does support your point that it's unusual that these leave any lasting impression. And the fact that this one has left such an extraordinarily negative impression is significant. I mean, Donald Trump, we do remember a little bit about his campaign launch. And the reason for that is actually mostly negative. It's mostly, at least in my mind, the memory that Trump had paid seat fillers to attend his campaign launch, which was a very embarrassing news story that came out of it, which I suppose does suggest that it's possible to have a bad and embarrassing campaign launch and then go on to win the nomination. I have some memory of Amy Klobuchar's campaign launch because it was in the snow and there are all these photos of her being covered by snow. Really, the only reason why hers leaves any memory in my mind is because of that visual, which I think helps underline why DeSantis might have made a mistake to launch in an audio-only format without any visual at all.
I think if we're going to look at it in revisionist history, what I remember from President Trump's campaign launch was not only coming down the escalator. Yes, I remember those stories in real time about him paying actors. However, what by far in my mind is seared there is he used this opportunity to outline the platform he was going to run on, specifically by calling most Mexicans rapists and murderers that come to America. And while you and I think it's important, it was a positive for his campaign because that set the tone for it. And it was what truly won him a lot of the groundswell from the far right, in addition to his celebrity and everything else. So you can make the argument in the grand scheme of things that his campaign launch was actually positive. And then you mentioned the images and why it's important. Why Ron DeSantis should have done your typical launch is because what you mentioned with these visuals, John, he's a good looking guy. His wife is a good looking woman, and they have good looking, like your idealized version of a family. There's multiple kids. They're young. They're cute, so on and so forth. So bare minimum, all he had to do was deliver a speech convincingly, assemble a crowd to applaud that speech, and have his family sitting behind him. And at worst, John, his campaign launch would have been forgotten about. And that would have been much better than what we experienced. So I think that it was puzzling, but I think also that using social audio and not going this traditional route, there are two ways to look at it. Either it was done out of a desperate nature where they're trying the new gimmick, and by trying the new gimmick, they're trying to get more media attention than they otherwise would. And they did get a lot of media attention before the event. And the other way to look at it is a little bit more nefarious. It was that Elon Musk bought Twitter. Twitter is struggling. Elon Musk is one of the top 3-5 wealthiest men in the world. Things in American politics like super PACs exist. So by doing this massive favor for Elon Musk, generating all of this buzz and the media attention, not only could you get maybe 100, 200, who knows, $1 million from Musk to a secret super PAC that nobody would ever know about, kind of like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge deal. But also, maybe Elon Musk will manipulate the Twitter algorithm to favor Ron DeSantis instead of Donald Trump, which can be a powerful thing considering how political media is rolled out and how big topics on Twitter can earn you hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of dollars in earned media.
I'm sure that this might have been part of the rationale on the part of DeSantis and maybe even Musk.
In theory. Right?
Yeah, in theory. But the very predictable technological problems that happened did not end up making Twitter look so great. In fact, the whole incident was kind of embarrassing for Twitter. And it should have been foreseeable to DeSantis and to Musk. And when we get into the social audio thing and our analysis based on our experience of social audio, we'll be talking about this. So while I understand your point that, giving this exclusive event over to Elon Musk and over to Twitter could theoretically have helped build a close relationship between those two, which could have benefits to both. In practice, it kind of backfired on both sides of the equation. The other thing, since we're talking about DeSantis's relationship with these big media companies and why to build a relationship with Twitter, he might have chosen to give the launch over to Twitter. We want to mention another big media company that's a factor in all this and why the decision to go to Twitter could have been a negative one for DeSantis, a harmful one for DeSantis, a risky one for DeSantis, is the role of Fox News. So Fox News for the last couple of years have been very diligently hyping up DeSantis's candidacy. And we talked about this on a previous show, that Fox News, being interested in moving on from Donald Trump, given their complex and often difficult relationship with Donald Trump, have put a lot of effort into trying to consolidate Republican Party opinion around DeSantis as a potential candidate. And they've built him up into being perceived as this great major figure, the big next leader of the Republican Party, to the extent that he hasn't necessarily always matched in his true person. The fictional character of DeSantis you hear about on Fox News being in many ways much more impressive than the real DeSantis that exists.
He's a paper tiger because of what you're expressing with Fox News.
Yes, they've hyped him up so much that the real McCoy kind of disappoints. But Fox News really have gone way out of their way to this end. They've spent so much time building up DeSantis. They've given him so much valuable earned media that his decision to go to a rival company with this exclusive launch event seems misjudged. It seems like something that would really irritate the heads over at Fox, something that would really insult them, a quite active, meaningful snub. And because of Fox News' role in building, shaping opinion among the GOP cohort, something that could really backfire. If they decide that they're no longer on Team DeSantis and shift their coverage and their commentary away from DeSantis, that could be very damaging.
Yeah, because the folks that watch Fox News, even if it's down from 3 million a night for Tucker to 1.5 million, they're older, reliable, conservative voters. 1.5 million a night on primetime is more than are going to listen to, care about, or be influenced by Elon Musk. Never mind the fact, John, and we'll get into this later, that most of the people on Twitter are international. So they're not even necessarily Americans that are these Musk fanboys or were in the audience. I think.
But Justin, keep in mind that Twitter under Musk have been trying to build themselves a bit as a rival of Fox in particular, that there is a little bit of animosity here because there is a sense that they might be competing for some of the same voices and some of the same listeners. Think about what Tucker Carlson said after he was fired from Fox, said that he was in conversations with Elon Musk and he wanted to start publishing his videos directly onto the Twitter app instead of going to any other media publisher. There is definitely the sense here that the two companies are in competition. So for DeSantis, who had been built up by Fox so much, to go to this company that's needling at Fox and saying, we want to steal your audience, we want to steal your talent, and so on. I mean, that's really a pretty sharp snub.
So in addition to what we kind of just explained, where DeSantis was falling like a lead balloon in the polls rather, from January until March, April, May, until he launched. And with that momentum that was negative, he wants to have a launch to reverse that momentum, get some media attention, use that media attention to snowball some positive interactions with folks, rehab his image, and go forth. The other reason why you do this is you want to appeal to a certain sect of voters. So I think it's important when we look at the ones we could remember, which was Kamala Harris, President Obama. They were both basically messages of hope, and they were to a wider audience. President Trump was a message of hatred and fear, but that was to a wider audience. You're aging, white, older American. Ron DeSantis, though, didn't necessarily take that tact. And we can get into that because of the composition of the social audio audience, but also the type of speech he gave. Do you remember, or did you look up where President Biden gave his speech and what the message was, maybe who it resonated to?
I do not remember much about the launch, but I remember where Joe Biden wanted to do the launch. And I remember that Joe Biden, I'm not sure if he actually did end up launching it here, but I remember that Joe Biden had been saying, at least, that he wanted to launch his campaign in Charlottesville, Virginia. And this was partly because Biden had often pointed to the far-right political violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, as the raison d'etre for his political campaign. He famously had been pressured not to run in the 2016 cycle and had maybe regretted that decision, but at this point was in clearly a state of retirement. And his decision to come out of retirement, he often explained, was inspired by watching the political violence in Charlottesville in 2017. If any of our listeners don't remember, 2017 in the summer, there was a far-right political rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, which was protesting the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general who fought against the United States in the Civil War. It led to the murder of a counter-protester, a woman named Heather Heyer, who was there to protest against the far-right groups that had gathered in Charlottesville that day. And Donald Trump, after this violent incident, said that he was sure that there were good people on both sides. That is, good people on the side of the counter-protesters, but in Trump's mind, good people on the side of the far-right groups that had gathered to support Robert E. Lee, one among them committing this murder. So Joe Biden wanted to launch there because he saw one of the foundational sins of the Trump period was this incident and Trump's reaction. Given that, it's kind of interesting that DeSantis chose to launch on Twitter, because from the perspective of many in the DeSantis cohort, the great injustice that must be solved by his campaign has to do with Twitter. Instead of the injustice taking place in Charlottesville, the injustice took place on Twitter. The idea that Twitter were throttling the voices of right-wing activists and so on. This has become a real cause célèbre for people on the right wing in the United States. And perhaps to them, it's the mirror of the Charlottesville injustice and the Charlottesville violence that Biden wanted to address.
Yeah, and I think that what you're drawing a contrast in a way, right? Also, so Biden drew a stark contrast to Trump, whereas instead of drawing a contrast to anyone, what DeSantis did was he basically mimicked Trump, because Twitter and social media and these conspiracy theories about censorship were Trump's cause well before they were DeSantis's cause. Who is the key audience demographic of this specific social audio company? We, John, experienced a much different nature of things on Clubhouse because we were vigilant about who we were going to let on stage, how we were going to approach the programs. We could have increased our audience size probably exponentially if we did a bunch of conspiracy theory topics. On Twitter Spaces, though, John, the folks that are the people involved in social audio the most are the most extreme conspiracy theorists. You'll get Sebastian Gorka on stage. You'll get the gentleman, I can't remember his name right now, Tom Fitton, maybe, from the Federalist Society. Is that his name? He's the guy who's like promoting all these election conspiracy theories. And then you'll get Ian Miles Chong and all of these other like weird conspiracy theorists, like super online. I guess they'd call themselves black-pilled Republicans. Those are the people that DeSantis decided to launch to, like Biden did the Teamsters, or Obama did his Chicagoans, or Harris her Oaklanders. And I think that it kind of speaks to the general nature of why he's launching on Twitter Spaces. Aside, putting Elon Musk aside, it was to specifically resonate with these hyper online, hyper right wing conspiracy theorists that DeSantis and his team believe not only have momentum in the party as potential activists, and I will note, John, Ian Miles Chong is like in Germany or some shit. Like, he is not an American. He's not a voter.
I think he's from Malaysia. Is that correct?
Is he? Yeah,
I think so.
I think he might be. I think he's like stationed somewhere in Europe.
I visited Malaysia. It's a lovely, lovely place. But I did not encounter Mr. Chung when I was there.
So anyways, John, so not only is it these people that potentially DeSantis and his team look at as activists, but it's also, and what do you think about this? It's the cohort of people who have been Trump's staunchest supporters for the last 7 years, from QAnon to Trump mainstreaming the QAnon stuff, to then the Proud Boys, to Trump telling them to stand back and stand by. A lot of the energy of his campaign has come from these people. And that's maybe another reason why he was trying to launch his campaign on Twitter Spaces.
I think you put your finger on something pretty interesting in a few different regards. So the first is this aspect of audience control. Usually when a campaign do a launch event or any other event, they have control over the audience. They have control over the whole event, really, because they're planning the whole thing with their advance team. They're setting up the stage, setting up the visuals. They're determining who the speakers are going to be. And they also have a degree of control over the audience. You can decide whether you're going to admit anyone who shows up or whether you want to have some kind of filter, signups, whatever. And for a launch event, maybe you'd want to curate that very carefully. And in the case we mentioned, Trump, there's the extreme where he's actually hiring the people who are in the audience. So there's the complete level of control over who's there in the audience. DeSantis choosing to do this launch event on Twitter Spaces and handing over kind of the organization of the event and the running and moderating of the event to a third-party organization, he's losing that level of control over the audience that he would otherwise have. So he did end up not only with a lot of mainstream journalists in attendance right there in the audience with their names listed right next to him on the stage, so to speak, as we call it in the world of social audio, but also a lot of strange online activist types, some of whom you mentioned by name. Ordinarily, this would not be something that a candidate would want. They would want to have a higher degree of control over who's attending and wouldn't want an affiliation with those types. But at the same time, like I think you've suggested, it is an aspect of DeSantis's campaign strategy to try to court some of those influencers. There's a story 2 days ago in Rolling Stone about how a key pillar of the early campaign strategy from DeSantis is the right-wing influencer angle, that they're trying to pick off some of these key right-wing online influencers from the Trump side and are doing this in ways that are sometimes pretty aggressive. And the example in the article from Rolling Stone was about the Babylon Bee, which, as people may or may not know, is kind of like the Onion for conservative Christians, like a satire news site, very popular in right-wing social media. DeSantis appears to have hired one of the key people at the Babylon Bee to be a communications consultant and is actually paying him tens of thousands of dollars to do this work for him. So DeSantis, in his interest in cultivating support among these right-wing social media influencers, has taken to actually paying them, which is something that certainly should build a kind of affinity. And I think that the Trump team have really cried foul over this approach because they see it as an outright bribe to win over these kinds of influencers. And the Babylon Bee principal himself is saying, oh no, I know how to keep this separate. I'll keep running the site with my satirical integrity at the same time as I'm also on the side working for DeSantis. But us in this world, I mean, we recognize that as much as people like to insist that they can keep those lines clear, it's not really possible.
A lot of these online, super online folks have already made up their decision. Ben Shapiro, a lot of the folks at the Daily Wire, they know who they're going to support. For Ben Shapiro, it's going to be Ron DeSantis. Launching on Twitter Spaces will not impact that in any way, shape, or form. So it felt like he was chasing something without understanding the real ecosystem of what he was trying to kind of conquer. So I think that from a strategy point of view, he leaned into some of his worst assets. From a understanding of earned media and how to change the narrative and get momentum, he failed no matter what. Even if everything went off very well, he was not going to get the same audience that you get on Fox News, which would be 2-3 million viewers if you did your speech and it was live streamed on Fox, CNN, MSNBC. Then if you give that speech, John, they're going to take clips of it, whether good or bad, and replay that at least 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, because they have the visual and they can replay it. But it's all off of that hype of this was the initial launch. This is what we're going to take away from this potential candidacy. What he did was he went on Twitter Spaces, then gave a Fox News interview with Trey Gowdy that very few people watched because it wasn't new. It was the second act of the launch. And that kind of leads us, John, into the just structural issues with doing it on Twitter Spaces. So I mentioned 2-3 million viewers on Fox. It would be amplified, live streamed, very likely on other televisions, multiplied maybe 4 or 5 million more if you get a CNN hit simultaneously. You and I knew. I predicted maybe 200,000 concurrent listeners would tune into a Twitter Spaces. And it certainly doesn't mean that they're all going to be Americans. Like, you're going to get these Nielsen ratings where they're just covering Americans. Additionally, they're not going to be the older, more reliable voting cohort. It's going to be these younger folks, if they even are in the US. So I want to get into here the structural issues that we saw with Twitter Spaces and social audio, because it's a new type of medium.
Justin, I'm making a list of the different factors that I think are problematic in the way that social audio works for this kind of an event, right? And first, I want to say how much we love social audio, Justin. And I don't want to disparage the medium of social audio, because we had overall a great experience using it. It was the birth of this show. We had some great conversations.
If nothing else, John, we've turned into damn near best friends because of Clubhouse, right? We're talking every week.
Yeah, I mean, we were spending a lot of time running programs on Clubhouse. We brought on a lot of great people, and we learned how you could effectively moderate a discussion in that kind of forum. And we learned how to incorporate audience questions, how to keep the audience kind of controlled, try to keep things without going too much off the rails. We really learned the ins and outs of the medium. And it's a great medium for a lot of things. It's not necessarily a great medium for this kind of an event. And I'm going to go through some of the reasons why, after saying all these positive things about the medium. I don't want to disparage social audio. It's wonderful. It's not great for this. So let's go through a few of the reasons why, some of which we've already talked about. So the first thing is this thing about audience control. We've already gone over that. That's the first thing. The second thing, the technical difficulties. Justin, when we tried running programs with big guests, because we did bring on such extraordinary people like Leon Panetta, the former Secretary of Defense, former CIA director, former White House chief of staff,
former OMB director, which was important for the death.
He's just the former everything. And he was also played by James Gandolfini in an Oscar-nominated movie. And not too many of our guests are really able to say that. But anyway, we had problems with audience volume where when we had multiple thousands of people trying to listen, we were getting all kinds of technical difficulties. And this is something that we encountered with large audiences. And Twitter, their social audio network, I think, works less well than Clubhouse's. And it was very foreseeable that there would be an issue if you had a lot of concurrent listeners for an event like this, which I'm sure they were hoping to have. So that's a big problem. Another thing is the lack of visual. We talked about this. And just like you said, it matters for your memory of the event, but also how the media replay clips of the event. If they don't have a good visual, what are they going to do? Just put still photos on top of the audio of you talking? That was something that the DeSantis campaign tried to do, and it looked kind of ridiculous after the event, which brings me to another one of the problems, the audio quality of recordings. So not only do you not have a visual that you can replay, but the audio quality of what you're recording, it sounds more like a phone call than it sounds like a smooth, professional media product. And that's something that we've been encountering as little clips of DeSantis' speech have been replayed. We're hearing that fuzziness in the audio. And, again, foreseeable problem. And something that we encountered when we were recording all of our programs on the app, especially the guests that would call in. Sometimes we weren't getting great audio. And now that we're not doing an app, we're getting better audio.
And John, just to really put a fine point on this that I'm just thinking about now, during the Twitter Spaces with David Sachs, Elon Musk, and Ron DeSantis, obviously Elon Musk and David Sachs sounded like they had microphones. It really did not sound like Ron DeSantis was speaking into a microphone. So even if he wasn't just speaking into his phone, his team did not set it up properly. So not only is the audio quality poor, but juxtapose it to much better audio quality from the person's asking the question to his really, really poor audio quality. It just exacerbates everything you just outlined.
Yeah, he sounded like he was on a speakerphone on a conference call. And so this is not only just about the concept of the event, it's also about the execution. And there was a problem with execution across this event. Another thing, the inefficient audience. And you touched on this a little bit, Justin, how there's a lot of international listeners. But let's not even just think about all the people that are going to hear the speech, live or not live, because you get that with television too, right? On television, CNN will replay bits of the speech, whether you do it in a big stadium or whether you do it on Twitter Spaces. And that's going to be seen by people who aren't voters in the United States, right? Think about the audience that are in the room. Think about that. Think about the efficiency that you lose there. So if DeSantis had chosen to do a typical live campaign launch, he could have filled the room in New Hampshire or Iowa or South Carolina or Florida, any of the states that he wanted to focus on. He could have filled the room with relevant stakeholders, with people who are the voters and the funders and activists and the campaign workers and so on from those locations. And the only people that were in the room, you could have 100% efficiency where everyone there that's participating in the real event, the live event, is someone that you want to reach. And you lose all of that when you move it to a forum like this one. Another issue, no audience applause, no energy in the room. That's something that you're really missing out when you do an event in this kind of forum. For us, I actually think that it worked really well for what we wanted to do with social audio, because we wanted to have critical conversations with experts and newsmakers where the audience applause and reaction was not coloring the substance of what was being said. You can do a real kind of an interrogation when you don't have people cheering and waving, right? This is the problem that we saw with Trump's town hall on CNN, right? It would have been better if it was in a space
social audio space.
And in the social audio world, we saw people who wanted to have different kinds of rooms where they did want to get that enthusiastic reaction to something someone said, not really being able to execute it because you can't hear the audience applauding, you can't hear the audience laughing or cheering after a joke or a big crescendo. So that was all lost.
And for us, John, the reason why social audio works so well is we were having people on with dissenting viewpoints. And we just, even if we weren't interrogating them, right? Let's say we're going easy. We just wanted to get their viewpoints out with as little bullshit as possible. So they didn't feel like they had to cater to an audience. Whereas, as we'll get into, this event was sycophants. It was literally everybody who asked him a question had already endorsed him.
Well, I mean, in a typical campaign launch, you would have sycophants in the room, but you'd be able to feel that energy of the sycopathy.
Exactly.
You'd be hearing them cheering and applauding and laughing. And none of that was felt by this medium that they chose. And I think that was in particularly problematic because of the choice of moderators. When you had David Sachs and Elon Musk as the moderators, people who don't really have the ability to build that kind of positive energy in the way that they speak and interact, it was totally drained. So DeSantis gave his whole speech. Well, he read it off, and he read it off as quickly as he could, sounding like he was just trying to get through it. No applause, no laugh lines, nothing. And when he gets to the end, ordinarily you'd have the cheering from the audience. He gets to the end of the speech, and what he gets is a bit of dead air, and then David Sachs unmuting and saying, thanks for that.
Well,
this is not what you want from a campaign launch. And again, foreseeable problem, not only from the medium, but also the choice of moderators.
Everything was foreseeable. And I want to hone in on one thing that I already brought up, but you highlighted. So the audience size, right? There were technical difficulties. John, you and I know how social audio works. On Twitter, it's based on your social graph. So if you have an account like Elon Musk, who has 130 million followers, more people are going to see that this is happening. However, there are ways, just like on Clubhouse, on Twitter, because we were working with some folks at Twitter to throw some Twitter Spaces, which we did with John Dickerson, for example, Steve Schmidt. We did some good Twitter Spaces, but it seemed very apparent to me, and we ran into this on Clubhouse, John, that Twitter was artificially trying to boost the audience for this event. And in a way, they were trying to mess with the back-end algorithm, boost this thing up so that they did at one point, 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 people went into the room. And it was Elon Musk who started to give an introduction to the discussion. 30 seconds in, it would drop out. And you would hear nothing for 30 seconds. It's the top journalists from Fox News, New York Times, down to Free Beacon, Ben Shapiro's, whatever that weird outlet is, and then a bunch of just your normal voters. This happened literally, no joke, for 25 minutes. I had to message people, John, are you able to listen to this? Is it my phone? It started crashing my phone. Twitter, the app, would crash. I would try and go back in. And the reason why I think, and it just goes to show you, we knew the audience was never going to be that big, but it just goes to show you it was artificially boosting, because when they turned off the boost, they made a claim that they couldn't speak through Elon Musk's account because it was glitching out. We both know that that's not how it works. They just ultimately, what they did was, it was David Sachs sitting next to Elon Musk. They'd mute, one would unmute, and one would talk. But ultimately what happened was they closed down the whole room, the 5, 6, 700,000 artificial listeners, maybe some were even fake at the time. They restarted it, and then they just did the conversation from David Sachs's audio to essentially save face, and they stopped boosting the room. And when the actual announcement came down, it was 200,000 listeners. So I think it goes to show you that the flawed structure of social audio led to the technology problems because of the inability to get an audience.
And here's the thing that you're pointing to, Justin. The event started late, and what were the consequences of that? So events starting late is not unique to social audio. Absolutely not. Campaign events in person, in live settings, start late all the time. Not unusual at all. In fact, it's quite common. But if an event starts late in that kind of setting, what happens? It's a bunch of people sitting in the stadium or auditorium listening to Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow and Only in America, and looking at balloons and talking about how they are excited to see Barack Obama or Mitt Romney.
And the media is hyping it up. Oh, we were told it was going to start 20 minutes ago. We're getting word now from the comms team. It's going to start in 5 minutes, and it's building anticipation.
And people in that live setting are not leaving because the event starts late. You don't show up for the in-person Barack Obama, Mitt Romney event and say, 20 minutes have gone by. I'm going to leave. I can't wait any longer. You carry on listening to Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow. Maybe if it's a Trump event, you're listening to Tiny Dancer or YMCA, but you stay there in your seat and wait. In this event, 20 minutes meant half or more. I think, what was it? It went from 700,000 to 200,000.
Yep.
What's the attrition rate of that? 70%, 60%?
Like you said, it's typical for events to launch late and nobody think about it. The whole story of his presidential launch became the tech glitch. So sure, he received a bunch of people were like, he's going to receive all this earned media from this. He was never going to if it went well. He received a ton of earned media. And John, they did play audio clips of the Twitter Spaces after on these stations because it failed. They played the David Sachs, they played the Elon Musk, we're sorry, we have technological difficulties, and it became magnified.
At a certain point, I was wondering if was the only word that David Sachs knew in English, because it was the only thing that I heard him say, or at least a very large percentage of the words that I heard him say. The last thing that I want to mention of these foreseeable issues that we encountered in our experience with social audio, and certainly were reflected during this event, is the niche interests of audience members who attend these kinds of events. So this was something that we were always kind of dealing with and combating a bit as we ran our programs on Clubhouse. But we found that there are certain topics that people who attend social audio events are obsessed with. Chief among them, cryptocurrencies. On the Clubhouse app, how often did we encounter people who only want to talk about cryptocurrencies, and how we had to learn how to identify who some of these people might be in the audience, make sure they were excluded from questions. When we heard questions about cryptocurrencies coming up, try to move along because we knew that most people do not want to hear about this. We had no interest in it, but there are certain types of obsessives who keep this in their minds as the number one issue in the world and take any opportunity to bring it up, right? It is very annoying. In no way is interesting to the average voter but it's something that we found that the types of people who attend these events are absolutely fixated on. We had to deal with this, remember? All the time.
I have PTSD from listening to these losers go on about these cryptocurrencies. We would talk, John, we would be talking about the history of Ukraine well before the Ukrainian war, and somebody would ask the guest a question about cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
And it's like, we have a preeminent leading think tank foreign affairs scholar who was under Secretary of State during ex-Bush presidency, talking about North Korea and Kim Jong-un. They're giving us a history of this deranged mind and how he controls nuclear weapons and what the future policy actions should be, the implications. All they want to know about is, are they going to mine crypto in North Korea? It's like, what is wrong with you?
Cryptocurrency obsession. And so, again, this is an issue with the medium, that it seems to attract this particular fixation. And this was reflected during the DeSantis presidential campaign launch. So he does his speech, or rather he races through it with this sense of aggravation almost, as he, I think, feeling that the event was going poorly, trying
humiliation, John.
Yeah.
It felt so just to really put a fine point on it, 30 minutes of just technological glitches, and then they turn it over to him, and not only he was going through it very quickly, like you said, and you mentioned this, but you could very clearly, John, tell that he was reading the words because there was no emphasis, there was no pause, there was no change in tone for effect. It was just like he was literally trying to get through this because he knew he was small time and he just wanted to get it done.
I think there was certainly a sense of aggravation for how the event had been going up to that point, but also the energy that you get from that audience interaction, you're not getting in this medium. So instead of feeling what the audience was responding to and thus adding your emphasis and pausing and all of that, it was a flat, cold reading. It sounded like a cold reading. It can't have been, but it sounded like one. But after he gives the speech, and instead of the applause, he gets the from David Sachs. They do try to go over to audience questions. And what do the people in this audience want to ask him questions about? Cryptocurrencies. They don't want to ask about immigration, inflation, major policy issues that are affecting the country. That
the economy, candidates, war in Ukraine.
Yeah, education. Often these are issues that Republican candidates do want to talk about. Yeah, abortion. Instead, it's about cryptocurrencies. So, again, this is another feature of the nature of social audio that attracts these kinds of questions. Foreseeable issue, an issue we encountered, and an issue that was very much reflected during this event.
And just to double down on this, so I do want to get to the nature of the questions and interactions. But first, so cryptocurrencies, Dana Lash, this was not one of the first questions, but she was asking about something called Operation Choke Point. John, we do shows where scanning the news, we're interested in this stuff generally. I mentioned Operation Choke Point to you earlier today, and you're like, what's that? I'm like, John, I have no idea. It's some type of messed up conspiracy about crypto, and I don't even know, like the government trying to hold it down and all this stuff. But that's just one example. Another questioner. So you had Thomas Massey. We can get into his question because it's funny a little bit later. But Chris Rufo. Chris Rufo, the general American doesn't know. The general Republican primary electorate voter doesn't know. He gets up there. He asks about DEI, ESG, and there was another acronym. And it's like, I understand these are buzzwords for woke and what you do, but most of the audience's head had to be spinning because they were talking like crypto in this online code, John, that didn't resonate really with anyone but these sycophants. So you got to understand that some of this was the purpose and the point of doing it from DeSantis and his team's perspective. And I know you have thoughts on that. But also, there is no way that they thought that if they could plan and script this all out, that these weird, freaky questions would be the only questions that they get. And then to make it worse, we knew this was going to happen, John. So when folks come on to ask you questions about a topic, let's say we have Secretary of Defense Panetta on, or you have we hosted a live show during a hot war in Gaza, and we had 50, 60, 70,000 people come in and out. And you need to be aware of what the social audio medium is and who you're going to get and how to direct these people to ask their questions. But what normally happens is there's a large audience. This is the largest audience many people have ever spoken to, and they now have the floor. So what they do is they filibuster. And it's great, John. Like that is, I love our audience. Outside of a show, when we don't have somebody on stage who's a guest, whose time is valuable, and we are being gifted their time to ask them questions, pick their brain. I want to learn about your day. I want to learn about what you do for work. But in a presidential launch, you don't want people to grandstand. Not only did these people grandstand, John, but this weirdo David Sachs was asking these questions. DeSantis was on the stage. And then Elon Musk, who owns Twitter, was on the stage. And all these people that overlapped in this weird online world are Elon Musk sycophants. So they would get on stage. John, the first member of Congress to endorse Ron DeSantis, did this. Thomas Massey. They get on stage for 2 minutes. They say, Thomas Massey goes, well, Mr. Musk, I must say I'm a huge fan of yours. You probably don't know this, even though I'm a Republican. I'm the first member of Congress to ever buy a Tesla. And he goes on about Tesla for like 2 minutes about how he like hooked up a generator in his house off this old Tesla motor. And thank you, Mr. Musk. Buying Twitter was the greatest thing. So, Mr. DeSantis, what do you think about wokeness in schools? So not only did they filibuster, not only did they turn their attention to Elon Musk, but they built up Elon Musk so much because they were probably trying to gain curry and favor from him, that they juxtaposed the way that they revered Elon Musk with the way that they just asked Ron DeSantis a question. And I have no other words to it. It made Ron DeSantis look like small-time shit. It made him not be the center of his own presidential announcement, which is insane, and you would only get that on social audio.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about this. By incorporating Musk and by putting so much of the focus of the event on Musk, Ron DeSantis was overshadowed by a celebrity at his own campaign launch event, which shouldn't happen, right? And I'm trying to think of other examples of something like this. Donald Trump could never be upstaged by another celebrity because at the time he ran, he was already one of the biggest celebrities in the United States. I'm thinking about when Mitt Romney at the 2012 presidential Republican convention was introduced by Clint Eastwood. And Clint Eastwood gave this very strange speech with an empty chair that he pretended was President Obama and that he was having a foul-mouthed dialogue with the imaginary President Obama. And this kind of bizarre bit of stagemanship really did overshadow Mitt Romney's own speech. And you have a bit of empathy because you think about how Hollywood and Washington are in this kind of mutual jealousy arrangement where everyone in Hollywood is obsessed with Washington and thinks Washington is this exciting place that's bigger than them. And then everyone in Washington kind of thinks the same thing about Hollywood, especially Republicans who seem to have a little bit less interaction and love from Hollywood and so have built it up even more. And how the Mitt Romney staffers must have been so excited the idea of having this Hollywood icon introduce their candidate only to be a bit embarrassed and very much overshadowed. But I think that this also, it demonstrates the obsession with celebrity and the very online nature of DeSantis and his team, who were so excited about being up there with Elon Musk. They made it more about Elon Musk than them. And I think that this betrays a little bit of DeSantis's nature, where he does sometimes seem to be the smaller man in the room and overshadowed by the bigger person. When DeSantis ran for governor of Florida, his most famous or really infamous campaign ad was one that depicted him as a toady of Trump and an obsessive of Trump. It showed him teaching his little children how to build the wall and reading them children's books about Trump. I'm reminded a little bit of Tom Wambsgans, the character from Succession, who's always there to suck up to the bigger person in the room. In the most recent episode, very much mirroring DeSantis in doing that to the character that's based on Elon Musk. But I'm also remembered of a comment about Lindsey Graham, who this was observed by Steve Schmidt. Now, Steve Schmidt, a polarizing figure, says a lot. But one thing that he said about Graham reminded me of this. So this is a quote from Steve Schmidt talking about Graham. And he says this about Lindsey Graham. the way to understand Lindsey Graham is to look at what's consistent. And essentially, what he is in American politics is what in the aquatic world would be called a pilot fish, a smaller fish that hovers around a larger predator like a shark, living off its diet. That's Lindsey Graham. When he swam around the McCain shark, broadly viewed as a virtuous and good shark, Lindsey took on the patina of virtue. But whenever the apex shark is there, you will find Lindsey Graham hovering about, and Trump is the newest shark in the sea. He has a draw to power, but he's found it unattainable to gain on his own merits. So that's sort of like what we're seeing a little bit with DeSantis, where when DeSantis needed Trump, he kind of sucked up to him and was the smaller man under Trump's shoulder. And now, when he should be trying to break out on his own and create the sense that he is the new leader of the GOP, he's doing this with Musk and turning his own presidential campaign launch into an event that's about Elon Musk instead of about himself.
I think he's a little scared. We've seen that recently. It's June 2nd here. DeSantis has gotten pilloried for not being that personable. So in New Hampshire, he was asked questions from reporters. He just turned them down. He was asked why he didn't have a town hall and get questions from the voters in New Hampshire, which if you don't do that, it's a pretty offensive thing. So what does he do today, John? He takes his first audience questions from a stage in South Carolina with his wife sitting right next to him. So I don't know if he's a follower, but most of the campaign coverage I've seen is Ron DeSantis' wife giving a campaign speech. It's not even him. It's her giving a speech. I think he's just not ready for the big time because of his social awkwardness, predilections, whatever it is. And I think that's maybe another reason why he gravitated towards a format where you can just be reading your speech.
Let's go in a little bit into the substance of what DeSantis has been saying, which, as we've described, has been very much overshadowed by all the other issues with the campaign launch. But one thing that I certainly was concerned about, I think you perhaps shared my concern to a certain extent, many in the media had this concern, many of political commentators had this concern, was when is DeSantis going to attack Trump directly? He seems like he's so reticent about doing so, and the clock is running, even though we've got a lot of time before the election. We're now 7-8 years into the whole Trump political experience, and we've seen this issue where potential rivals wait so long to begin the direct attacks. And this was concerning in the build-up to DeSantis's launch because he never seemed like he was willing to make these direct attacks. Whereas Trump, of course, was calling him a pedophile and saying his wife faked cancer and all these horrible things. It's so asymmetric. That fear, I think, concern has been assuaged. I think at this point, I'm no longer concerned that DeSantis is going to wait to attack Trump directly. I think that that's begun. And I'm reminded, of course, of the repeated pattern of how these campaigns operate, how even sometimes at the point of the first presidential primary debate, you've got the candidates all being very polite to each other. And it seems like it's going to be very kind of cordial, but things inevitably break down and become very antagonistic as it goes on because the competitive nature of these candidates will always emerge and things will always get nasty, no matter how long it feels like it's taking to get there. So I'm not really concerned about that anymore. The direct attacks have started. But what are these attacks? And so I think that the DeSantis campaign have made a very clear decision that they're going to attack Trump from the right. They're going to make appeals to social conservatives and appeals based on the kind of understood set of values and issue positions of the kind of right wing of the Republican Party. And that's where they're going to go. They're going to say that, Trump isn't a real social conservative. I understand the theory behind it. And we've talked about this before, how the person that will take out Trump and the Republican Party isn't going to be a moderate softy that's beloved by people on the other side of the aisle. It's going to be someone that can actually win over Republican voters based on what those voters want, which is often kind of right wing. But I think that thinking about Trump on this traditionally understood left-right axis of the United States is often a mistake because it is often so hard to pin Trump down on policy issues because he's been everywhere on all of these issues. He hasn't had a lot of consistent issue positions. So if you're trying to attack him from the right and say, look, he's not really a conservative, you can point to something he said but you'll find that he's also said the opposite on the same topic. So that can be pushed around every way.
One of the research things that I had to do was when Trump was saying, I was never in favor of the Iraq war. It was all, I think he was saying it was all Bush, and then he tried to blame it on Obama. The RNC had me go look through his quotes back before the war. And he had one or two quotes where he said, I don't know about getting involved. And like a week later, he had two quotes saying the exact opposite. You know what? This is a great opportunity for us to get involved, stamp out terrorism, and take all their oil. And just to your point, he says everything. So he can always stake out a position on it because his supporters are sycophants.
Yeah, it's unclear where he stands on almost anything. And it's very confusing to try to track. So it doesn't really work to try to establish that he stands somewhere that the Republican Party voters don't want to be on a topic, because you can always find an example of him on the other side. The other thing is that generally, Trump is actually pretty comfortable hitting Republicans from the left. That's already how he's begun to attack DeSantis in some ways. So if we remember the previous primary, the 2015-2016 Republican primary, Trump was often on what was understood as the left side of big issues. He said that he was committed to social welfare programs, and he attacked Republicans for wanting to cut them. That's what he's doing now again with DeSantis. When it came to the Iraq war, he tried to paint the rest of the Republican Party as aligned with
neocon warmongers.
Yeah, George W. Bush's unpopular positions, which were what the Republican Party stood on at that time.
Even gay rights. He was to the left of the entire field for a little bit. Like you said, he's flip-flopped, but that was a big thing.
And the gay rights thing, this is one of the topics that DeSantis is going to try to hit Trump on from the right. I think social issues generally is kind of what he wants to focus on. He's saying, I'm the one who's really committed to fighting against the woke culture, the liberal culture. Trump isn't really. I don't think Trump is really that perturbed by this. Like I said, he's actually pretty comfortable taking this mismatch of positions, often which are understood as the left-wing positions. It's hard to attack Trump on this idea of the political spectrum and left versus right. It doesn't really work the way that people think it does. And I think that's partly because voters don't fit into that spectrum in the way that people think they do. I think that focus groups and campaign strategists try to fit things into these boxes, but the way the actual voters think about a lot of topics is not that clear. There's a lot of Republican-based voters who love social welfare programs. Sometimes they'll admit it, sometimes they won't. They're as hard to pin down as Trump is a lot of the time.
Just think of all the stories, and there were some Obama-Trump crossover voters. There were some Bernie Sanders primary Trump crossover voters. And to your point, just the other day in Iowa, and this is a smart move by President Trump, he was extolling the virtues of his socialism. He was extolling the virtues of how he gave the Iowa farmers $28 billion in handouts to deal with China. That is as Bernie Sanders left as it gets. Give out big government money to hard working class people. And Trump is not only comfortable there, that's where he fits. He fits in with these left positions because he's a big New York Democrat at heart. He just happens to be a misogynistic, racist predator. So he kind of crosses the lines a little bit. But like you're saying, he is very comfortable on the left. And the interesting part is most of these hardcore right voters, even if they are anti-vax and they like RFK Jr. and Trump created the vax with Operation Warp Speed, they are Trump supporters. The weakness for President Trump is the college-educated, older Republican voters. And those are the voters that Ron DeSantis is not even going after at all, giving a thought to. So he's trying to gain momentum by going after Trump's strongest supporters. And that just, it doesn't make any sense. It's not a viable strategy.
So what you pointed to there with the COVID stuff and the vaccine stuff, that brings us to another point that I wanted to make, which was, if you're not going to be successful at pinning down Trump on these policy issues, which the other Republicans never really have been, even though the Democrats have had success with that. The Republicans haven't had as much success with that. One attack that had kind of been developing that you've been hearing a lot from GOP types was Trump is too focused on the past. We heard this a lot after the 2022 elections, that Trump's focus on 2020, Trump's focus on the past was hurting the Republican Party. And you needed to move on to someone who was looking forward to the future. Trump was always talking about the stolen election, quote unquote. Of course, we all know it's lies, but Trump was always talking about the election in 2020, and he couldn't move on from that. He was living in the past. He was focused on 2020. He wasn't looking forward. The Republicans need someone to look forward. So this should be the grounds for a DeSantis argument. But the problem is DeSantis has become fixated on COVID as one of the key differentiators, supposedly, between him and Trump. Now, the actual factual basis for that differentiation is itself a little bit confusing, but it's something that the campaign really want to try. They want to talk about the so-called lockdowns. They want to talk about the vaccine. These are the things that make us different from Trump. What's the problem there? You're talking about 2020. You're talking about the past. We don't have a pandemic on the horizon. This is a once in a century event, hopefully, but probably. And it doesn't really speak to what your policy is going to be going forward, or even what your vision for the future of the country culturally and so on is going to be going forward. It's looking at the past, and it's looking at 2020, the same thing that we keep hearing that Trump is doing wrong, talking about 2020. What's DeSantis talking about when he tries to bring up COVID all the time as a differentiator? 2020.
While Trump does not have many forward-looking economic policies, he does have some staples. One is obviously anti-immigrant, it's xenophobic. The other is anti-China, and through cracking down on China, we're going to unleash American businesses. And lastly, it's his career. He's made, what has it been, 50 years now? He has created this persona that is completely based on lies and a fake TV show, The Apprentice, that he is the jobs king. He is the economy king. So if you just ask people who aren't following politics that well, how does Trump do on the economy? They think, oh, he's this savant. He's a billionaire. He's a businessman. During his first term, whether you agree or not, the economy was doing well. He passed this massive tax cuts bill. Ron DeSantis, he's the governor of Florida. You don't know him for his economic policies. You know him for his attacking minority groups, for the woke stuff. The only economic policy you know him for, if you're a conservative, is using the power of the government to attack big business, which is anathema to a lot of the ideals of these older Republican college-educated voters that are actually up for grabs. So there was a poll that came out today. Normally, after a presidential launch, you get at least a couple points bump. For a main contender, you would expect, 5-10 points bump. So DeSantis is basically down still 30 points across the board in all these different polls. But they asked in select states, in Nevada, in New Hampshire, in Iowa, in South Carolina, in Florida, what are your perceptions on who is better on the economy, Trump or DeSantis? In near every state, Trump had 50, 60%. He was up 30, 40 points on the polls on the economy issue. In Florida, where DeSantis was the governor, his whole message is make America Florida. In this poll, Trump was winning on the economy question by 28 points. So this guy not only has no campaign message, during his time as governor, he has had no economic message. His whole economic message has been, we didn't close down during COVID. So there is no vision for the future. It's impossible for him to kind of create one now when he didn't think it out, when he didn't announce it at his launch. Now that we're starting to roll, it's going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we've really heard much of a real economic message from Trump either.
But he doesn't need one. He doesn't need one. The perception of him is he is the jobs guy. And Republican voters still, they still believe he's better than Biden on the economy.
I think that Trump might be the first fictional character that we elected as president, because just like you said, the voters who support him didn't vote for Donald Trump, the person. They voted for Donald Trump, the character from The Apprentice. They voted for someone who wasn't a real person. The character that Trump played on television also happened to share his name, but he was a fictional character. It wasn't the real Trump. It was someone who had been created by Mark Burnett and then played by Trump on TV. That was who they elected, just like you've said. They didn't elect the real Trump. They elected that character. And, you know, you pointed to the perception. I mean, something else that you mentioned when you're talking about the perception of him was that he was this anti-China warrior. I mean, that's equally untrue to the claim that he was responsible for a booming economy, really. If you compare Trump and Biden's policies on China, it's very clear which one is more aggressive, ambitious, and antagonistic, and which one was more friendly and interested in bringing the U.S. and Chinese economy closer, which was what Trump's team were attempting. But I mean, that's the difficult thing, is how do you pop that bubble? And I think that that's what DeSantis is going to continue having to face on the campaign trail. It's very hard to run against a person that's not real when so much of the electorate believes in that myth.